If suffering through an unhappy childhood leads one to become a more developed artist, then Richard Yates had a great advantage. Not something he found easy to talk about later in life, but once in a rare time, he would throw out a remark about sitting alone in the dark as a child, waiting for his mother to come home from her bar hopping. If he himself was drunk and sad, he would sometimes talk about his mother's drinking problem, the same drinking problem that he perhaps inherited. Or even more rare, he would admit to his intense anger towards her. Truthfully, it seems he's both admired and hated her equally. Now, this only further complicated matters. You see, in his writings, the pain would shine through like a ray of light cutting through thick, dark clouds. It was through his writing that he would find some semblance of redemption. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, despair, and family. I'm your host, Jason Nemore Harden, inviting you to join us as we explore the life of Richard Yates and his novel, Revolutionary Road. Richard Walden Yates was born on February 3, 1926, into the very staple of American middle class in Yonkers, New York. Now, his father, rarely spoken of, was one Vincent Yates, an electric light salesman who separated from Richard's mother when Richard was just 4 years old. Now, Richard's mother, Ruth Walden Maurer, most often called Dookie, was an aspiring, though unsuccessful, sculptress. Well, even before Vincent left, money was a constant issue for the small family, continuously moving around the West Village of Manhattan. Now, during this time, Richard, who was quite shy, was forced to pose naked as a faun for a series of statues that his mother wanted to sculpt. Now, trapped in a deep struggle with alcoholism at the time, Richard recalls the time his mother left vomit on the pillow next to him after a heavy drinking binge. Now, despite incidents like this, he never considered her a bad mother. Well, things only became more bleak after Vincent departed. And between Ruth's unstable economy and drinking problem, money was scarce. The mirage of success, however, was as important as ever. So perhaps for this reason, Richard attended a horribly competitive prep school in New England during his formative years. It was painfully clear that he was the poorest of the students and was unfortunately ridiculed and bullied for it. On the upside, he honed some writing skills by editing the school magazine, a craft that would later change the path of his life. For much of his early life, his mother was his only comfort for the most part. His sister provided some comfort, but she was more of a daddy's little girl, however. Thus, following the divorce, sought to be with her father regularly. Richard, on the other hand, never really knew his father. So he chose to stay at home with his mother, who was sort of a kindred soul and temperament. And there it was, the height of the Great Depression. Money was as short as it ever had been. The father provided whatever small amount he could spare in the way of alimony and child support. However, Mom insisted on a higher standard than her economy could sustain. She would rent large apartments in upper-class New York neighborhoods she couldn't afford. Thus, when money ran out, like it always did, she would sponge off friends and neighbors until there was no money left to borrow and was then forced to move. Now, rather than wallow in the misery of their chaotic lives, Mother Yates encouraged her children to look at their lives as an adventure of sorts, telling them that it was the three of them against the world. And their favorite leisure activity was going to the movies. Now, Richard discontinued the habit of watching movies entirely as an adult. He went so far as to not even plugging in a TV set that was once left to him. He could, however, give detailed renditions of the movies he'd seen as a youngster in the late 1930s. In a 1981 essay, he mentioned how books wasn't his thing as a child, how reading was such hard work for him that he tended to avoid it whenever possible. Movies, on the other hand, gave what he needed, providing a great deal of story in an easily digestible format, as well as a good place to hide from the stresses of everyday real life. As a teenager, he joined the Army, serving as an infantryman during the Second World War, surviving stints in both Germany and France. Now, during his service, he perfected his smoking and heavy drinking habits. Well, out of the Army and back to New York City, he was conflicted. Take advantage of the GI Bill and attend college, which was the initial plan, or get on with his writing career. The decision? Put off college, read as much as possible, and lead the life of a quote-unquote knockabout intellectual, very much like his protagonist, Frank Wheeler, in Revolutionary Road. Now, later in life, he would regret not having attended college. His real reason turned out to be fear. Fear due to a low IQ score of 109 he received while in the Army. He didn't want to run the risk of further failure and thus decided to better himself by taking evening courses in creative writing at Columbia University. Now, whether or not these classes had any impact on his later writing remains unclear. Anyway, inspired by the early characters of Ernest Hemingway, Yates landed a job in Food Field Reporter as a trade journalist, which helped him move he and his mother into an apartment on Hudson Street. Then, in early 1947, he was hired as a rewrite man on the financial news desk of the United Press. A big move up, a weekly salary of $54. Things seemed to be improving. His daily routine was also somewhat appealing on account of its simplicity. He'd report in at the Daily News building at 10 a.m. in suit and tie, listen to the racket of teletypes and Wall Street cronies for 2 hours or so, then adjourn to a bar on 42nd Street where fat slabs of roast beef were free with dime beer, followed at last by a long afternoon of punching out leads until it was 6:30 and time to go home. An easy day-to-day routine. The only problem? He only had the vaguest idea of what he was supposed to be doing. Now, during this same time period, he had the pleasure of meeting Sheila Bryant. They married on June 8, 1948. Well, after 2 daughters and a tumultuous decade-long marriage, they divorced in 1959. However, it might very well be argued that this marriage, his keen ear for dialogue, as well as his relationship with his own mother, would help him whip his writing chops into shape and create his first novel, Revolutionary Road. Quote, "If my work has a theme, I suspect it is a simple one, that most human beings are inescapably alone, and therein lies their tragedy." End quote. Yates considered the best novel he'd ever read to be Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, published in 1856. Madame Bovary incorporates themes that apply to both Revolutionary Road and the life of Richard Yates. Now, in the novel, and mirroring one striking aspect of Richard's own mother, the eponymous character lives beyond her means in order to escape the banalities and emptiness of provincial life. Like Yates's novel Revolutionary Road, Madame Bovary is also a bleak story about a marriage that ends in tragedy. Of the novel, he would say, "Madame Bovary is probably the greatest novel I've ever read. Nobody ever is to blame in that book. There are no villains in that book any more than there are in what I guess is my second all-time favorite novel, The Great Gatsby." The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which you can hear more about on House of Words, episode 72, made a profound impact on him. From first encountering the novel, it was an absolute milestone in his evolution as a writer. Without Gatsby, one can very well speculate that Yates would have found some other endeavor to pursue. Gatsby, he declared, was his formal introduction to the craft. The lyricism of the prose had such an impact on him that he could hardly read the last page of the novel without tears in his eyes. He admired the essence that the first-person narrator presented, one who is both enchanted and repelled by the world he exists, the world of the wealthy elite, but also in the fundamental lessons the novel provided. As Yates wrote in his essay titled Some Very Good Masters, quote, "Every line of dialogue in Gatsby serves to reveal more about the speaker than the speaker might care to have revealed. As an example, he offered, quote, "the awful little party in Myrtle Wilson's apartment." Yates would add, as a man, he was very nearly overwhelmed by his times, almost literally destroyed by his times. But as a writer, he managed to produce Gatsby. No, I think it's a cop-out to say that our times are too hectic or frantic or confusing for good traditional formal novels to emerge. I think that's just a cheap answer. End quote. It is, however, important to point out that books with unhappy endings were the only ones that Yates seemed to admire, or the only ones that shaped him as a writer. While tragedy and calamity and downfall were elements that would shine through his work, he also admired honest writers who could look squarely at all the horrors of the world, face all the facts, and still come up with a hard-won, joyous celebration of life at the end, in spite of everything. He included novelists such as Charles Dickens, James Joyce, and Joyce Carey as examples of this. Quote, "Never say anything that doesn't improve on silence." End quote. Yates's characters were more often than not outsiders, misunderstood characters that were rejected by the community. They would, like most real-life people, strive to belong somewhere. Very likely because of his own upbringing and rough childhood. Perhaps the reason he chose to create and flesh out such characters was that he found little interest in successful people. Rather, the failures, they intrigued him. Although he appreciated the allure of failure in writing, he didn't write malicious or outright evil characters. He felt that despite there being evil people in the real world, characters that reflected such evil did not work well as characters in fiction. To him, that made it too easy for the reader to blame everything on that one character, thus removing gravity from the story. He preferred the kind of story where the reader was left wondering who was to blame, and that hopefully it would dawn on the reader that he or she had to bear some of the responsibility of the blame, at least on an emotional level, on account of being human and therefore infinitely fallible. Now, regarding his style of writing, he was a slow writer, painstakingly obsessed with details, which most often left him dissatisfied with the early drafts of his work, which additionally in turn made his writing process a time-consuming and expensive endeavor. According to him, most of his first drafts read like soap operas, leading him to repeatedly go over a scene in order to get the desired emotional depth. He suspected that if he hadn't revised and edited heavily, he would be a superficial writer. Furthermore, he added that the first draft for Revolutionary Road was very thin and very sentimental. The book was written longhand and took an arduous 5-year-long process to complete. Now, Richard Yates knew that he would never change and would never write with the speed and confidence that he saw in the work of others. Nevertheless, in a letter he wrote, he suggested that the time it took to write a book bore no relation to its worth. He went further to elaborate that, despite the fact that it had taken Fitzgerald only 10 months to write The Great Gatsby and Edward Lewis Wallant less than a year to write The Pawnbroker, his work was no less than theirs, and vice versa. Working time, in other words, has nothing whatever to do with quality. Now, a longer quote by Yates about the autobiographical element of his writing. "I'd written a good many careful, objective stories over a good many years, stories in which there may always have been an autobiographical element in one sense or another, but in which none of the characters was ever wholly myself. Then I wrote Revolutionary Road the same way. There's plenty of myself in that book. Every character in the book was partially based on myself, or on some aspect of myself, or on people I knew, or composites of people I knew. But each of them was very carefully put through a kind of fictional prism, so that in the finished book, I like to think the reader can't really find the author anywhere, or to put the same thing another way, he can find the author everywhere. I've always admired Flaubert's great line, "The writer's relation to his work must be like that of God to the universe, omniscient and invisible. And I was trying to live up to that ideal. End quote. While many writers struggled with the ending of a story, Richard Yates had the ending for Revolutionary Road all planned out before he began working on it. Rather, his predicament came with finding a way to justify the ending he had in mind. A Revolutionary Road would be widely read as an anti-suburban novel, which was not his intention and something he would be disappointed by as its success grew. Now, the protagonists of the book, the Wheelers, may have blamed all their problems on the suburbs, but that was not the way Yates felt about it. That was the character's delusion, not the author's. Now, when asked whether the title of the novel suggested an attack on the system, he replied that it was meant more as an indictment of U.S. life in the 1950s than directly of the system. According to Yates, during the 1950s, there was a general lust for conformity all over the country, a blind, desperate clinging to safety and security at any price, which was only amplified in the political world with the Eisenhower administration as well as Joe McCarthy's witch hunts. Now, while this seemed to be the status quo, many other Americans felt deeply disturbed by what was going on, deeming it a betrayal of freedom as well as the revolutionary spirit that was once held so high. Now, it was this revolutionary spirit that Yates did his best to embody in the character of April Wheeler. Now, another false interpretation of the book is that it criticizes the foundation of marriage. Now, this seems to be a direct consequence of the note literary critic Alfred Kazin wrote to the publishers after reading the book. The letter, which was incidentally a nice one, read, "This novel locates the American tragedy squarely on the field of marriage." Now, the publishers seemed to like the quote and plastered it all over the dust jacket in big red letters. They thought it would make the novel easier to sell along with the cheap, vulgar illustration. Now, Yates, who trusted them, allowed it, something he'd deeply regret later, because despite maybe helping to sell a few more copies, it most likely turned away more intelligent readers. In an interview, he added, "After all, who but a maniac or a goddamn fool would sit down and write a novel attacking marriage? And who'd want to read such a novel?" He, however, did not blame anyone but himself for letting the publishers package the book in such a way. In the midst of writing the book, he attended a party and was asked what his book was about, to which he replied that he thought he was writing a book about abortion. Elaborating on this, he explained that it was going to be built on a series of abortions, from an aborted theater play to several aborted careers to aborted ambitions and aborted plans and dreams, all leading up to the real physical abortion and death at the end. Now, in later years, he would still consider this to be the closest to a real summation of the book he ever had. The novel would also contain what he considered to be the best scene he ever wrote, saying, "The breakfast scene between Frank and April, just before he takes off to work on the day she dies. I always thought that came off nicely. He draws the diagram of the computer on the napkin and she says, 'It's really sort of interesting, isn't it?'" The character John Givings, the mentally ill son of the realtor, however, was not pre-planned. Needing somebody to point up or spell out the story at crucial times, Yates found inspiration in a young man he'd known. Following the muse of this young man, this character, John, occurred to Yates about midway into writing the book. Now, the young man in question was a long-term patient in a mental hospital who had uncannily keen and very articulate insight into other people's weaknesses, which led Yates to create a fictionalized version of him. For this character, nothing was off-limits to shout out or question. Unfortunately, some of the traits of this character would reflect on Yates' own life in his final days. By his final days, Richard Yates saw himself as a failure. All of his books despite high critical acclaim and copious praise from literary giants like Kurt Vonnegut, Tennessee Williams, and William Styron, never sold very well and quickly went out of print. His 2 marriages failed, he lost custody of his 3 daughters, and he was persistently short of cash. Add to this his struggles with emphysema and bouts of tuberculosis, which led him to losing a lung. As if this list wasn't enough, he was also plagued by depression and only found solace in liquor and cigarettes. Although he was tethered to oxygen tanks, that did not halt his smoking habit. Well, like the character John Giddings, he suffered from multiple nervous breakdowns, which led to hospitalization. Despite the initial success of Revolutionary Road and his own feelings regarding it, it would regretfully be neglected. Along with all his other novels, it went out of print before the end of his life. When asked whether he felt his work had been neglected, he answered that in his more arrogant or petulant moments, he still thought Revolutionary Road ought to have been more famous. He was quite displeased when he heard that it would go out of print. Then, when writer Norman Podhoretz made a very small reference to it in his book years later as an unfairly neglected novel, Yates wanted every reader in America to stand up and cheer. Deep down, however, he knew that kind of thinking was nonsense. After all, it did quite well for a first novel, much better than average. It received generally good reviews, plus it was nominated for the National Book Award. Years later, a great many paperbacks would be sold as well, and it was widely translated and published abroad. Ultimately, however, his view of life's prospects was too brutal to appeal to the genteel literary culture of his time. Meaningless characters leading meaningless lives is how a reviewer for The New Yorker described Revolutionary Road. Yates tried to sell story after story to the magazine, and with each failure asked why John fucking Updike enjoyed the New Yorker's patronage and he did not. Well, finally, fiction editor Roger Angell came clean about Yates' prospects. It seems clearer and clearer that his kind of fiction is not what we're looking for, he wrote snootily to Yates' agent in 1981. I wonder if it wouldn't save a lot of time and disappointment if in the end, if you and he could come to the same conclusion. Again, in his later years, when thinking back to the time following the publication of his first novel and subsequently his first book of short stories, he blamed himself for what followed, stating that what happened after his first 2 published books was his own fault and nobody else's. He speculated that if he had followed them up with another good novel a few years later and then another one after that, he might have begun to build the kind of reputation some successful writers enjoy. But instead, he tinkered and brooded and fussed for more than 7 years over the book that finally became A Special Providence. Eventually, he couldn't honestly claim that his writings had been neglected. He reasoned that it probably received just about the degree of attention it deserved. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, he reflected on a particular difficulty as he summed it up in his life's work. I'm one of these writers who has the misfortune to write his best book first. Now, the novel has gained more attention in the years following his death, but still has not reached the levels of respect it deserves. In the words of his friend, Kurt Vonnegut, Richard Yates not only gave us compassionate, meticulously detailed portraits of our own flawed selves in fiction, he was also a major player in American history. As usual, let's end the episode with a quote. This one from Revolutionary Road. If you don't try at anything, you can't fail. It takes backbone to lead the life you want. End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Hardin. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez, narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Hardin, and music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Hardin.